Okay, here we go. Chapter 10, and it's called A Secret Door. Jason led them down into the stone room again. Rick carried the dictionary and the book full of clay balls, the parchment with its translation, and what seemed to be the only working pen in the entire house. I saw an open space, okay, Jason insisted. There was an empty space behind the rock. Rick was doubtful. You mean the cliff is hollow? Jason nodded. Let's say you're right, Rick responded. That would explain how you managed to find the box, but now we're talking about a much bigger hole than the one the box was in. And Julia read the box's message out loud again, and she was, in her own words, obsessing about it. When the grotto's darkness seems defeat, shine a light upon the fleet. She stopped and stared at them. Wait a minute. It makes sense. It totally makes sense, she said. The message talks about a fleet, and a fleet could only be found at sea. Whoever wrote this message, Ulysses Moore, Jason interrupted. What? That message was written by Ulysses Moore, Jason stated. Who else could it have been? It was written in English, and he used an alphabet from the Phaistos disk to turn it into a code. Okay, sure, but why? She didn't wait for an answer. If there's a grotto inside the cliff, and I do mean if, Jason, there may be a treasure. And if, and I'm not kidding about the if you don't start thinking, I totally believe you. If there's a treasure, then maybe Ulysses Moore created some kind of a treasure hunt. Well, that's pretty far-fetched, Rick said. Do you have a better explanation? Julia countered. Is it really so crazy? Pirates used to hide treasure all the time. They made maps and stuff, she said, or at least I think they did. It was silent for a moment then. I think you might be getting carried away, Rick said. Let's take things one step at a time. Boring, Julia replied. Come on, Rick, use your imagination, she urged. The message talks about a fleet, right? And to have a fleet, you've got to be a big-time fisherman or a pirate. And if you're a pirate, you've probably got a treasure. Rick was not at all convinced by Julia's reasoning, but he bit his tongue, and there was no point in arguing with her. Besides, it was an intriguing idea. Jason thinks the message was written by Ulysses, Julia continued. I say he did it to lead us to a treasure. Let's imagine that there's a grotto inside the cliff, and all we have to do is figure out the earth lights and how we can get inside the grotto. And if I'm right about Ulysses Moore, Jason said, and it seems reasonable to believe that he was able to get in and out of the grotto fairly easily. Maybe, Rick conceded. I think the old man went down into the grotto from Argo Manor, Jason said, and I think I know how he did it. You guys are nuts, Rick exclaimed. It's one wild guess after another with you two, but go on. I'm listening. Please tell us, Jason, how did he do it? Jason triumphantly pointed to the hulking armoire that stood against the wall. There's a secret door behind there, Jason informed them, and if you give me a hand moving that thing, you can see it for yourselves. The door was intimidating, or in Julia's words, downright creepy. In many ways, it was no different from any other door in the house. It was just a door, but there was something unusual about it. It was old. For one thing, the wood was covered with scratches and deep gashes as if the door had been struck with a dozen blows. The three kids studied for a long time, and they had to work very hard to move the heavy armoire enough to reveal the whole thing. It seemed that the pieces of furniture had been placed there with the intention of blocking it, and now that it had been revealed, that intention made the door even more fascinating. Every instinct in Jason's body told him they had to open that door. You think this is it? Julia asked. Jason had picked up the map of the house. He marked it X on the spot where the door was located. Definitely, this is it, Jason explained. This is one of the secret doors old Ulysses used to sneak around. Jason, his sister said, will you stop with that stuff? Ulysses Moore is dead. Rick and Julia stared at him. What do you mean, Rick said. You saw a ghost or you saw the real living man? When I came down to get the pen, and it was only for a second, I saw a glimpse of a shifting shadow, and then it was gone. Jason looked first at Rick and then at his sister, their expressions of disbelief and disapproval. You don't believe me, do you? He asked. Julia paced across the room, running her hands through her hair. I'm such an idiot, she exclaimed. This is how you saw the grotto, too, isn't it? He said. He accused Jason. Yes, Jason answered. I can't believe I was such a sucker, she fumed. The grotto, the hollow cliff, the secret passageway behind this door. You made it all up. You didn't see a grotto. You just imagined it. No, Jason pleaded. I saw it. Julia looked at her brother squarely in the eye. Swear it, she said angrily. Swear to me that you saw a grotto. Jason felt his face grow flush, and he closed his eyes and pictured what he'd seen when he was dangling from the cliff. It had been an empty space. No, he didn't see it. He sensed a vast space. No, in truth, not even that. He sensed something, like there must have been a space behind the cliff, and it was a feeling, but everything in his heart told Jason to trust his feelings. Even so, doubt crept into his mind. He hadn't truly seen a grotto, just as he had to admit he hadn't truly seen the shadow of Ulysses Moore. Jason, Rick said. His voice sounded far away. Are you okay? Jason looked around the room, tired and defeated. No, he said. I can't swear that I saw anything. Julia turned her back on him angrily. Rick looked at each twin. Julia was furious. That much was obvious. And Jason, well, he just looked nervous. And at the same time, he was defiant, as if he knew he was right. It's not so important what you saw or didn't see. Let's stick with what's real, Rick said at last. Are you listening, Julia? Without turning around, she nodded yes. We know that this box really exists, Rick said, holding it up. It is real. And the message is real. No one imagined this. No one made it up. It's right here. He handed the parchment to Julia, and she turned to face the two boys. Rick pointed to the door, and that door is very, very real. Julia looked at him and then at Jason and relented. So let's open it. Since the door had no handles or knob, Julia tried slipping her fingers in what seemed to be a keyhole. She tried pushing and pulling and wiggling it around. Nothing worked. It's solid ground. No, it's a solid door, she groaned. Jason slowly ran his hand over the ancient door as if probing for secrets. He knelt before the keyhole that Julia had jiggled with her finger. It's like a puzzle, a door that can't be opened. Well, why can't a door be opened? Rick asked himself out loud. The answer is simple. It must be locked, and he pointed to a series of holes in the door, and that must be how we unlock it. Julia leaned closer. On the left half of the door, there were 4 keyholes positioned crosswise, like the angles of a diamond. Not 1 key, but 4? Julia sighed. Could this be any more complicated? We could try talking to Nestor, Jason suggested, or search the house inch by inch, drawer by drawer, hoping we'll find the keys, Rick offered. That would take forever, Julia cried, and she was beginning to despair of ever getting past the door, when suddenly there was a gust of wind. A loud thump came from upstairs. It's him, Jason exclaimed, and he leaped to his feet. They raced up the stairs and into the tower room, only to face one more disappointment. It was just the window once again, banging against the frame of the old sill. Rick slammed it shut. The latch is loose. That window didn't open by itself, Jason murmured, and he searched the room with his eyes. Somebody or something wanted us. This window is his signal for us to come up here, and he gestured to the model sailing ships that were arranged on the desk. Were these like this before? He asked the others. Do you remember? It looks like they've been moved. Beats me, Julia shrugged. The lead ship in the miniature fleet was resting on the top of a slender book with a dark leather cover. The model was long and tapered, its framework made of dozens of tiny sticks held together by glue and thread. Kind of like the bridge you're building, Eli. Rick was unsure, and none of them had noticed the book on their last visit to the tower, but they'd left so quickly racing after Julia to go for a swim that it'd be hard to be certain. It may have been here, Rick said, and I don't remember, but, well, that's the only logical explanation. We just didn't notice it before. Jason picked up the miniature ship and placed it in Rick's hands. Rick read the small copper plate on its base. Nefertiti's Eye, he said. That must be the name of the ship. Rick turned the model over in its hand. It looks Egyptian. I'll bet these sticks are papyrus. Jason opened up the small, handsome journal that had served as the ship's pedestal. It was a diary. Someone had jotted down notes and comments in tiny scrawl that was difficult to read. The journal was filled with drawings and scraps of paper. Egypt, Jason said with a slight disappointment. This is some kind of a travel diary about a trip to Egypt. Thumbed through the pages, there were hieroglyphics, a drawing of a golden mask of the child pharaoh Tutankhamun, a sculpture of the head of his mother Nefertiti, a map of the Valley of the Kings, where Tutankhamun's great treasure had been discovered, and much, much more. This diary is most about Tutankhamun, he told Julie and Rick. It's full of drawings, underlined words, notes, things circled in red. It's just plain weird. He continued reading through the pages. Ulysses Moore kept a list of Egyptian building materials in this diary. He must have been fascinated by their old lost culture. Rick picked the ship up in his hands. He must have been really meticulous when he made his models like He needed them to be exactly perfect. Julia placed her hand on Jason's arm. Wait a minute, she whispered. This must be the fleet mentioned in the passage. The fleet that takes you where you choose. It could be his way of saying that with these models he could travel to different places and times and, go anywhere in his imagination. She turned to Rick. Don't you think that could be true? Rick nodded. Possibly, but it seems too simple. We found this message hidden inside a cliff. Remember, and what about the Earth lights? Hey, what's this? Jason interrupted. He had turned a page and found what looked like a receipt of some kind, and it definitely wasn't from Egypt. Rick looked over at Jason's shoulder. Kilmore Cove Post Office, he read aloud. Final notice for package collection for the head of Argo Manor, 1 Salton Cliff, Kilmore Cove, 74820, United Kingdom. This should be enough to convince you that old Ulysses is dead, Julia said to her brother. He never got the chance to pick up his package. But nothing could shake Jason's faith. Maybe he left it here for us, he said. The window banging, the diary, the postal slip neatly tucked inside. Maybe none of this is ancient. Julia made a face. Look, Jason, for all we know, the diary could have been beneath that model the whole time. Don't start getting spookified on us again. We have to get this package, Jason blurted. He was determined. Today is Saturday, Julia said. The post office won't be open. We don't live in the city anymore, Jason. In fact, you haven't noticed. We're lucky Kilmore Cove even has a post office. Rick tilted his head from side to side. Small towns do have their advantages, he said. Around here, if people know who you are, they'll go out of their way to do you a favor. We can try Miss Calypso's bookshop. She runs the post office, too. Do you know her? Jason asked. Are you kidding? In this town, everybody knows everybody. One big happy family, Julia muttered, like the Simpsons. Jason bounced on the balls of his feet. Do you really think she would open the post office for us? Excuse me, guys. No harm in asking, Rick said. Guys, chill, Julia protested. What about the door, the secret grotto, the mysterious message? Suddenly that's not fun anymore? Now you want to go to the post office instead? Jason and Rick weren't listening. They were already halfway down the stairs. Is it just me, Julia muttered to herself, or does this all seem really lame? Then she brushed the hair from her face and raced after the boys. Lame or not, she wasn't going to sit around while they had all the fun. Chapter 11, in Kilmore Cove. It was late in the afternoon, but still well before dinner, when Nestor opened the door to Argo Manor's garage for the two boys. The door rose with a squeak, revealing a dusty place that was poorly lit by a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. Most of the garage was taken up by the shape of an automobile covered with a white sheet. Rick couldn't resist peeking underneath, and he saw a classic roadster from 1950. Nestor winked. It's my toy. Does she still run? Rick asked, admiring the car. Very doubtful, Nestor replied. Many years have passed since anyone drove it. Nestor proceeded around the car to the back of the garage. Aha, here it is. He lifted up a tarp to uncover a bicycle. Very old, very heavy bicycle, Rick noted in disappointment. Rick grabbed the handlebars and wheeled the bicycle out of the garage. Since his bike was damaged by Olivia Newton's car. I changed the name. He had hoped for something better than a rusty pile of junk, though. This thing looks older than you, Rick joked to Nestor. Still gets the job done, Nestor retorted. Don't let looks deceive you. Rick lifted the bike a few inches off the ground, feeling its heft. No gears, he noted. Man, this was going to be a killer to pedal back up to the house, but in a way he was already looking forward to the challenge. Julia and Jason, of course, had their own bikes, newer, lighter, faster. It would be a job to keep up with them. Nestor thrust a tire pump in Rick's hands, and he handed Jason an oil can and rag. Knock yourselves out, he said. Jason looked at the bomber doubtfully. Are you sure we'll be able to ride this to town and back? He asked Rick. Maybe this isn't such a good idea. The bike is old, but it's sturdy, Nestor interrupted. It will be just fine. As for coming back up the hill, the bicycle will do its job. The question is if Rick has the muscles and the heart for it. Don't worry about me, Rick said. He bent down and rapidly pumped air into the tires. Nestor glanced at him approvingly. Might I ask why you boys are going into town at this hour? Jason knitted his brows together, a telltale sign of his discomfort. No reason, Jason answered. We just felt like cruising around, maybe getting a candy bar. Not too much junk food, Nestor warned them. When you return, I'll have dinner warming on the stove. You guys have a good time. Minutes later, Rick was ready. Julia and Jason were on their boats, waiting by the boats. They were on their bikes. They weren't on their boats. Waiting by the gate. They waved to Nestor and headed down into town and the bay of Kilmore Cove. Julia shot out ahead, her hair flying behind her helmet. She took the first turn hard, leaning into it at a sharp angle, shouting happily, "Slow down!" Jason called out in protest, but then he, too, plummeted down the curving road. Rick pedaled slowly behind them, testing the brakes as he went. He turned his head one last time toward the great house on the cliff. Nestor was there, shielding his eyes from the sun, and he watched the three disappear down the road. "Who knows," he says. "Maybe they'll surprise us after all." The downhill ride was exhilarating, and their wheels were spinning effortlessly as the town came into view bit by bit, hairpin turn after hairpin turn. Kilmore Cove was a cluster of small houses painted many different colors, huddled together in the most protected part of the bay. The seashore road was intersected by a small connecting road that led away from the water, forming a series of T's by the sea. Cars crowded the narrow streets as their drivers searched for parking spaces. Julia was the first to arrive, and she jumped off her bike. The sign advised drivers not to park too close to the beach because the tide might carry off their cars. Julia wasn't sure if the sign was a joke or not. "Hey, I'll beat you, slug," she yelled as Jason pulled up beside her. Finally, Rick cruised his bomber down the last stretch of the road. He didn't mind being last. He was so grateful he'd made it in one piece. "So where do we find Mrs. Calypso?" Julie asked impatiently. Rick led the way, pushing the rugged, thick-tired bike in front of him. They moved deeper into the heart of town, passing by a statue of a sailor standing proudly with one foot on an anchor, a tribute to the town's seafaring heritage. They came to a beautiful fountain made of ancient stones. The water sparkled in the sunlight. "In here," Rick murmured. "I'm going to stop there and go make Papa his lunch. Love you guys."